A picture is worth 1,000 words, and yet we use words to paint a picture. Whatever that creative exchange rate, that's what I'm hoping to do for you today, to paint a picture of a place that is occurring throughout at least the first few books in the Ragnarök Chronicles, that being the towers, the stations in the outer region outside of our universes, within which Grail and the Brethren Lords live and operate. Hello and welcome to the Ragnarök Chronicles. My name is Dominic and this is a channel where I just take you through some elements within the books that I am writing. As I said today, I just want to go through some of the different places you could expect to find within such a station, within such a tower, so that you can start to get a picture, an image in your head of what kind of place this really is. As you can see here today, I have a prop because this knockoff lightsaber handle was the original inspiration for the towers, and in lieu of graphics to edit under any of these videos, it gives you something else to look at, however briefly, other than my face for once. So, near the beginning of everything in this current iteration of the multiverse, you had the Lords being built these towers, as they outside in the outer region, from which they were meant to study the Alpha Realm, our plane of existence, to document them. These giant space stations were somewhat built around random just like lumps of rock and spatial detritus that was floating around within the void. Built up around them were these more technological structures. As such, these things have got an almost inconceivable size, but we'll get to a more specific detail regarding that later. Now from the exterior, you can see they have some kind of red tinted windows, especially around the top, but also in some cases coming down the length of the relatively cylindrical body itself. Otherwise, it's various arrays covering the kind of black metal surfaces, and in some cases these large hinges, almost as if sections of the hull should open up to reveal something that might be inside. Don't know. As for the interior, the majority is actually taken up by processing units, because again, if these stations are each individually studying a given universe within the Alpha Realm, the amount of information that is to process, even just like the empty parts of space, that's so much that, yeah, you would need something this astronomically large to kind of keep all of that data. And say the Lords may have been at this for eons, but it would take that long, again, just to register everything that there is to possibly see. Since just saying it's processing units, though, is rather boring, let's go for some more specific other features that you might find. Somewhat generally, going from like the top to the bottom, but for the most part, there's no real perception of where exactly they're going to exist in here, they're just somewhere. Now, as I say, around the top of the tower itself is where you're going to find the shuttle bay. It's not often that the Lords or any of their workers would have to use a manual shuttle rather than beaming from tower to tower, but there are other structures that they do have as well around the outside of the Alpha Realm between the towers themselves. These are referred to as bridge satellites. We'll potentially get to those at a different time. And sometimes it's easier to take these physical shuttles, again, just to fly out to those. So you can get to those from the top, and beneath that, around where you have the more larger red windows, although obviously wouldn't take up the entire like cross-sectional area of the tower, given its size. Again, we'll get to in a minute. You have the council chambers. These large circular room with a circular table in the middle, surrounded by some thrones for the Lords to sit in. Sometimes there are goblets there to drink from. The Lords in general don't need to consume like food and drink as we do, but they can do just for the pleasure of it if they so desire. And again, therefore, you have a couple of other bits around the edge of the room to store any other kind of paraphernalia they may have for their meetings. It's at this stage that we may actually just want to briefly go over who the individual Lords are, because I don't think I have at any point in these videos so far. So okay, we have Grail, who is the head of the council, the one whom some may think of as the Grim Reaper, because he has a vaguely humanoid skeletal form and wears a cloak of nothingness, of darkness around himself. Then kind of second in command, you have Warren, who, again, all of them are vaguely humanoid. I say that with an asterisk next to it, we'll come back to that in a second. And it's more that humans happen to have a similar physiology to them, which is why actually while they interact with a lot of things in the Alpha Realm, they keep coming back to interact with Earth, because we as humans are the closest things to them physiologically. It's also why they would select us to be the Mancyns. Again, covered to an extent in the video on the main character, Philip. The main character for the first few books, anyway. Yeah, so Warren, again, relatively humanoid, but has a much more defined muscular structure, as well as a somewhat reddish tone to his appearance, and to an extent has some kind of pyrokinetic abilities. Usually it's more fire may build up inside of him, rather than him necessarily then manipulating it otherwise. No longer in any particular order, you have Mordrin, who is, while not skeletal, he's not a skeleton, he's much thinner, has very thin translucent skin, no blood, no lips, anything like that. To an extent, to start off with, he's the kind of person who wants to make sure he has the approval of his superiors and when he's told. However, when it comes later on throughout the stories that he becomes suspicious of certain individuals around him, he then also takes it upon himself to be the one to rally the others into seeing his truth and trying to expose those who may be hiding something. As for Stark, by comparison, I'd say the Lords don't have to eat, but he very much enjoys doing so. So it's got to the extent where he's probably taller lying down than he is standing up. He is rather lethargic in turn, doesn't really like to get his hands dirty or do anything really other than eat. He gets quite annoyed when he is ordered to do things rather than him being the one to order others to do it. Yet that being said, he is capable to defend himself if it really comes down to it. And then finally, for the current lineup, you have Petty, who is the one for which I had to add that caveat about them being humanoid, because that may be what he was once, but after an incident, again, many, many eons ago, he changed, became disfigured, became something a lot more animalistic. So it's rather a kind of greyish skin, but it can become purpled when he gets into a more animalistic state of bloodlust. Atop his head is a crown of horns. He has bulging compound insect-like eyes for his snout. His jaws don't really match. It looks like they're dislocated. One's kind of thinner, the lower jaw is kind of thinner than his upper jaw. As for his body, there's lots of lumps to it, kind of bones partially pushing out against the skin. There's talons upon his feet, with hands and feet. He's much more comfortable moving around on all fours than upright. When he's walking upright, he's kind of bow-legged. He's rather neutral when it comes to it. He's kind of fair. He tries to treat everybody equally, with the relative respect. And so therefore often in times of conflict within the group, he's usually perhaps the voice of reason. Now the reason I just wanted to go over them in kind of that brief overview, as well as, again, because I hadn't really done so beforehand, is because now, as well as the council chambers being near the top of the tower, you're also, for the most part, going to have the individual lords' chambers where they want to stay. Now, because of how many towers there are, again, there's a tower for every universe in the Alpha Realm, the majority of towers, they never actually visit, because that would be virtually impossible, even with all the time that the lords have existed. They're often moving between them as well anyway. When they do come to a tower, there'll be chambers there just in case, waiting for them. And they'll usually be personalised. For instance, Petty's quarters tend to be more of a virtual reality simulator, wherein it can generate the terrain of any given place that's been studied in the Outer Realm so far, and he can vent himself, relax himself, by hunting certain prey that might be native to that area. Meanwhile, for Stark, his chambers are just a place in which he can have copious amounts of food delivered to him. As such, the floor is covered in greasy remains, bloody remains, and he'll just like to recline in a specially fitted seat and just keep on piling things into his kind of, what's the word? Like, dislocatable jaw? The thing that snakes have, right? When you can open your jaw really wide to fit even more in. As for Griles, we'll actually get to him later. And they're the three actually that we really see within these 4 books. Warren and Mordrin. I don't believe there's any points in which you see any of their quarters, so they're not really described. The Lords aren't the only beings that exist within the towers, of course, they are the ones in charge. You also, for instance, have these beings known as the Fuhrmen. Now, the Fuhrmen were originally native to the Alpha Realm, and they exist in more of a wave state, an energy-based state. And so as the towers started doing their sweeps of reality, the precise nature of those scans and the beams that were cast upon the various worlds accidentally caught a hold of the Fuhrmen in their native habitat and dragged them up to the towers, and like a filter, they then couldn't get back out again. Now, the Lords could have just actually returned them to their homes, but instead they put them to work as a means of travelling around the towers themselves, because then these are cosmically large. So running through the towers, kind of like veins, you have these black ribbons that can go in any which way direction. And upon these ribbons are gondola-like boats, kind of covered in some form of plant matter, and at their back are these shadowy figures. It almost seems like they're not even really there. It's more like dark air in the form of hooded individuals. Sometimes, and ever since a certain incident that happened a few decades ago, which meant that anyone other than the Lords who was using the Fuhrmen had to give payment in order to use their services, ever since that point, to give the payment, they will conjure up a hand into which there are holes to put coins into. Now, of course, the hand isn't really there. Again, the Fuhrmen aren't really physical. Because they exist and operate in a way that is very similar to, say, our brain waves, they're more interacting with our minds and our perceptions. In order for the scenario to work, the person seeing them needs to believe that there is a hand being offered. Therefore, it looks like, for all intents and purposes, there is one. In fact, there isn't. Also, again, as part of that, as part of them acting in a way that interacts with your brain, they are also more like telepathic than communicating in any way verbally. But anyway, these Fuhrmen with their staffs, that again they're conjuring more from their dark air selves. Once a person is inside of the boat, they will then use these staffs to generate a pulling attractive force against the dark black oily ribbons in front of them, and so pull the boat forwards. Potentially at speeds that wouldn't make sense within the Alpha Realm, but out in the outer region, those kind of laws of physics, they're not as strict as they are here, so they can move much faster as is needed in order to travel through the towers, especially like the top to the bottom if they really wanted to go all that way. Also, the perceived gravity will always be towards the bottom of the boat, so regardless of whether it's going vertical or upside down or to the side, the passengers inside are always going to be secure. Now let's say that you're one of these passengers and you've been taken somewhere where you wish to access some kind of archival knowledge. So you've got off the Fuhrmen's boat and now you have entered the archives. What you will have found yourself within is this large chamber. A lot of things inside the towers are going to be large, but a large chamber filled with these kind of electric blue, they may look like bookshelves, but they're data banks, a kind of maze-like leading towards an open area in the centre. And you can obviously walk through these to find whatever specific files or whatever that you're particularly looking for and extract the data ports. While above you, in the kind of dome-like ceiling, the underside of that, you can also see projections of any files that are currently being accessed by anyone within that particular room. Alternatively, maybe instead you wanted to go to the brig, the place where they contain any prisoners or anyone of that sort that they may have brought upon the tower. In this case, you're now going to be more within a hollow column with lots of balconies lining it, and then these balconies in turn obviously got the barrier to stop you falling over the edge on the inner rim, whereas on the outside you then have these rows of cells, the bars to which, unlike the ones on Earth, more form a kind of web-like pattern around the cells instead. These cells can be fitted with extra equipment which can be used to particularly torture certain inmates in some specific way if needs be, but for the most part it's more just going to be like solitary confinement. Next, another column-like structure is actually the home to the main kind of worker within the towers. So the beings that are basically slaves, slave labour for the lords, are referred to as Bracknars. Okay, so these are kind of squat, crimson creatures which have a tusk coming out the bottom of their chin and both eyes on one side of their head. Not for any evolutionary benefit, but just because the lords couldn't be bothered to just make them in any better way. They don't matter, they are replaceable, we'll just make them with some cheap, quick manufacturing form. So yes, when they're not on duty, because it works in shifts, the Bracknars exist, or they live, within this column that's kind of almost been put together haphazardly, both in terms of its general structure, but also then in terms of the homes within it. Because the Bracknars build their own homes and their own resources, no one else is going to do it for them. And in turn, between these small hut-like structures, you also have kind of these open common areas in which the younger Bracknars that haven't fully formed yet and thus are not ready for work may play certain games, like kicking a helmet around the area and just trying to be the person to be in possession of the helmet for longest, or to be the one to get it within a certain goal. Not necessarily being on teams, but just being the one who scores. Because there is then open space around this column as well, there are energy nets that will be used to catch anything that happens to fall off the column itself, which will then guide anything to a given balcony from which they can then be retrieved. More importantly, the objects will be retrieved, the Bracknars themselves, doesn't matter. Coming off of one of these balconies then, that's now like the outside of the open space within which the Bracknars column exists, you're now going to be coming into one of the countless regular corridors that fill the towers. These things that are kind of jet black, probably made from the stone jet itself, that are usually lit by some kind of bracket torch, and down which you're most often just going to hear your own footsteps echoing backwards and forwards towards you through the inky darkness. Sometimes, off the side, you may come across some kind of workroom in which you have a basic table with seats around it and screens to work from. Alternatively, in terms of computers, there is actually whole massive areas of computers all lining a ring around the circumference of the tower, through which you'll have individual Bracknars studying different parts of the current scans being performed of the Alpha Realm. Alternatively, you could come to more holographic projections of, again, what is being scanned. So these rooms wherein large holograms of different planets that are currently being looked at are just hanging in the air in front of you, and you're able to zoom in and pick out different parts of those planets to identify any features that you may particularly be looking for. Kind of in the vein of projections and so forth, you also have chambers within which you can remotely pilot the ships that may be flown as kind of a fleet from the towers. So these crafts, which are referred to as Ravans themselves, they're going to exist in hangars which they just are all lined up behind each other in rows, obviously with the cockpit down for you to get into, and the legs standing behind them, kind of like a little forest of metallic legs that you probably walk between. But anyway, these Ravans, they can either be piloted manually, obviously within the cockpit, or some of them, as I say, are remote controlled. So you have these other rooms wherein you would sit back into this specially fitted chair, which will then connect kind of to your nervous system. So you're more or less using a combination of your brain as well as handheld controls to control this thing. And in front of you then is this massive screen upon which you can see from different angles based upon either projected calculations from the computer based on what it can tell is happening of the craft itself, and also from cameras on the craft hull itself. You can see what's happening to it and you can pilot it around whatever space it's in. Elsewhere, you then have the font of the Haver of Gelmir, this something like a stone pit, most often used to create new Bracknars, to replace the ones that have been destroyed in some way or another. But it's also the same technology that is used to turn a human into a Mancynn. It's also used to create kind of pseudo-lords. Like, as I say, there are so many towers in the network, there's no way that lords could ever visit all of them, and even the ones they do visit, they're only visiting them briefly. So to oversee operations of the Bracknars and so forth, the fonts in each tower will generate these other beings that aren't really alive, but they go around and ensure that periodically everything is operating as it should be. Operating, that is, in terms of, again, studying the Alpha Realm. So you also have these armories. It's really long corridors that are just lined with cases filled with many different artifacts and, well, because it's an armory, more often weapons or technology of that kind of offensive nature, ready to be selected if, for some rare occasion, that sort of thing is necessary. Probably the only ones who would be getting into that kind, or would be being sent into that kind of situation, are again the Bracknars themselves. And the Bracknars have kind of their own, like, smaller corridors with which they can get around the towers. Again, they're smaller creatures, they have smaller passages of which them to wriggle through. So if you follow some of these passages, you may, for instance, come to a more crystalline room. So it's not quite glass, but it still has that kind of transparent nature to it all of a sudden, through which you can see the different mechanisms operating inside of the walls going on behind it. You've got lots of different passages going on different places, and below you can see this massive cavern, or the top of it at least, a cavern that we'll be getting to very shortly. But before that, we'll first also just mention the embarkation room. So this is where you would go if you wish to beam down to somewhere within the Alpha Realm or to another one of the towers. The centre of this room is kind of your ovoid plinth within, or platform, within which there is a heptagonal hole that can open up to kind of let you through down into the beam itself. To control this platform, there is a separate kind of just command panel that is operated by a particular Bracknar that has the rank of 90. Above are these massive rafters upon which the Bracknars may just kind of scurry backwards and forwards to potentially lift cargo up or down to get it out of the way, because otherwise you then have these large crates here and there just dotted around the room that have either been brought up to the tower or are to be sent somewhere else. The walls of this room in particular, and potentially in other places as well, will, rather than having strict doors in them that you can see in a traditional sense, they will melt away when they detect someone coming near them. And then once that person has walked through, the wall will reseal. Now, for this next bit, I wanted to specifically just read a passage from the book, because while obviously all of these places within the towers are described, this is kind of the one real place where there is specific extended description. And I remember when I first wrote this, it was really fun to do so, to actually get this image that I had in my head down onto the page. So I just want to now give verbatim just as an description of the cavern that is below that I mentioned before, the bit which the beam will potentially pass through. So, behind him was a cavern of flames. Blurred Bracknar workers were busy in the glaring light, some falling to the depths below. Those that didn't might have shown stress or remorse at this at the beginning, but now such accidents were but a way of life, and so they merely carried on with their work. Rickety bridges crossed the crevasse to meet solitary pillars of stone jutting up from the unseen base of the tower. Bracknar scampered along these suicidal walkways, occasionally being hit by a jet of steam hundreds of degrees hot so fast that reactions on their parts were impossible. The renovation work that connected the cliff walls encircling the pit and the stalactite-scarred roof were rickety and badly made. Thin girders were standing in a fashion similar to a house of cards. Platforms looked as if they'd been dropped at random onto the structure wherever there had been a piece of metal jutting out. The white and blue flames licked the bottom of the workstations, leaving charred marks. All the way up at the roof, enormous metal rings protruded to meet the fragile construction, getting smaller and smaller with every one, ending at the size of a small human airplane, starting with one big enough to fit a small star. Green light emanated from the topmost and largest ring, illuminating the top half of the room, cave, whatever you wanted to call it, if it could even be called something like that, where the light of the gigantic flames didn't reach. Graal's chambers, minuscule compared to this monstrosity, were based in a south cliff face overseeing a ledge leading over the abyss by about 100 metres. To say that this is exactly 1/2 millionth of the way into the diameter of the abyss gives you an idea of just how big the tower is. All of a sudden, the ground began to shake. Shards of rock fell from the towering ceiling into the fiery crater, melting to oblivion even before they touched the dancing flames. And then the flames were out, sucked through tubes in the rim of the abyss. The workforce ran for cover from their building work into reinforced cages along the ledges on the opposite side to the onlooking pair. Yet one unlucky soul, well, it would be if it had one, tripped on a bar of metal and took too long in standing back up. A pure white beam plummeted from the rings above, destroying the little Bracknar, and escaped through the bottom of the abyss, now visible thousands of miles below. Life flickered back to the area a few minutes after the workers were doubly sure they were safe, as they all set back to their individual jobs, one replacing their dead colleague whose scream no one had heard in the roar of the beam. It hadn't been that important. None of them were, and they knew it. The flames reignited, increasing the temperature again to beyond what a normal human could withstand. So that built into the original rockwork, the asteroids that they had built the towers around from within the outer region, this chamber within there, right at the base of the tower, that which the beam flows through and out then into the outer realm, usually. Also mentioned there the idea of Graal's chambers. I alluded to them also earlier, but I kept them separate, because unlike the other lords, Graal instead likes to live at the base of the tower. Now here in his study, you have usually at least one 7-foot-tall mirror in every room, because he likes to look at himself, as well as windows from floor to ceiling that are thus even higher because the ceilings are so high up that extra bracketed torches are needed to illuminate that high up, beyond where the light from the fireplace doesn't reach. A fireplace that is ornately sculpted to have incorporated into it gems of pink, white, yellow, and blue. There'll be a table covered in star charts, or what could be called star charts if there were exactly stars within the outer region. Sometimes it's lights from the Alpha Realm, sometimes it's other towers or other structures that generally exist out there. And around such a table are seats within which the other lords can sit if they are visiting Graal. But Graal also does have his own kind of throne within the study, which is taller than him, and the feet of the chair itself are made out of converted raw time energy. That is to say, Boreal energy, souls from the Alpha Realm. And just took some that wasn't particularly being used as it was, in his opinion, and made it into part of his furniture. Now, as I say, there's going to be a study more or less like this in every single tower, just in case Graal comes by. But there's one particular tower that Graal of late likes to situate himself in. And that's the tower that overlooks, especially from his study, the rift that leads into the Alpha Realm. Now, the nature of this rift will be covered at another time, when we talk about the other important events in the early history of the multiverse. But here it acts as a reminder of the conflict that's now taking place across the multiverse, reminder of an event that took place there, and he can, I say, look upon its light from his window at any time where he's kind of literally gazing into space. And this study, while I'm ending the video here because it's at the base of the tower, going from top to bottom, it's also where the books begin. Quite literally, the first scene in Gift of the Mancynn takes place with Grile in that study. So in that regard, it is especially an important place. I hope that's now given you an idea of the kind of place that the towers are, the kind of setting that they provide for the parts of the narrative that take place there. Helps you to visualise them to some extent in your mind. Also hope in general that you found this kind of description interesting. As I said in the video about Philip, I believe, this is kind of, for the moment, going to be the last of the videos that are kind of more explicitly about Gift of the Mancynn, or if not explicitly about Gift of the Mancynn, those first few books, because as I said in the introductory video, these are, as videos, meant to be more about the projects that are further ahead, years ahead, that I'm not getting to yet, to just allow me some kind of mechanism by which to still explore them, rather than just them existing in the notes for future projects. So yeah, going forward, the next few videos at least will be from other parts of the Ragnarök Chronicles, further away, to get a bit of variety in there as well. I hope you found this interesting, hope you'll find those future videos interesting as well, and either way, until I see you again, don't forget to keep telling stories.